in St. Louis, it was about in 1992 that we actually began a project funded by a grant to support a number of schools. There were 5 in the first year and 10 in the second year, and we used some resources to help us to study this approach. It wasn't so easy to do at that time because there weren't that very many publications available. But we had the opportunity of having the 100 Languages of exhibit in St. Louis in 1991. Now there are many schools around the country that have gone to enough depth of understanding of this approach that it's reasonable for others to come and look at them as examples and inspirations, making it possible for people not to have to travel to Italy necessarily to understand what this could look like in a U.S. setting. But when we started, we were working with infant toddlers programs, pre-K, kindergarten, first and second grade, both in public and in private schools. We've done a lot of work over the years, and as presently, here we are in a public school district, Maplewood Richmond Heights. We wanted to especially work in a location that had a very diverse population, that maybe had lower socioeconomic situations, so that we could demonstrate this can happen in these environments. It's not just an approach that many think is only possible for elite, highly resourced schools. The philosophy that grounds the Reggio approach draws from many, many sources and is always open to new sources. What it has in common, of course, with the U.S. is that very strong value given to John Dewey's philosophy of progressive education, an American educator, to some of the common sources that we study in terms of theory and developmental progressions, Piaget's theory of active learning, Vygotsky's emphasis on the social process of learning. And so fundamentally, it's a constructivist, or one would say a social constructivist approach to education. That's not new to us. It's how it's played out, how it's researched, how this approach in Reggio Emilia has taken us to new levels of understanding about learning processes that may still be consistent with some of those theories, but actually, in many cases, as Lillian Katz has mentioned, the practice leads and informs theory rather than the other way around, which is how we typically think of theory informs practice. And it does there. But practice, because it's based on research, is continuously informing their theories of understanding about young children.
Think it's a big bear? Do you think that's what he hears?
Young children are able to make sense of their world. We know from a constructivist point of view that's what it's all about. They construct their knowledge. They take in through their senses, through their experiences, through their interactions, but all that's around them, but they have to make sense of it. And so one of the ways to support young children in making sense of their world that we've seen beautifully supported in the Reggio approach is through what is referred to as the 100 Languages of children. We all know children love to explore materials, love to play with blocks, love pretend play, music, movement, are growing in their vocabulary, to use traditional language and communication. But because they're novices in developing oral language, yet they can oftentimes jump right into using materials. The materials, when used in the appropriate way, can support that expressive language and the actual construction of knowledge at a much earlier age. Now, one of the things we see regularly in Reggio Emilia is that even at the infant toddler level, children are given opportunities to draw, to paint, to explore clay, to be involved with all the materials in their environment, giving them rich natural materials as well as scarves and feathers and paper and every kind of wonderful rich material you could think of. But very young children, infants and toddlers, need to explore it in a physical way to gain what Piaget would call physical knowledge before they can actually use it to represent ideas. And so what we see in Reggio, when we saw the work of preschoolers, 4- and 5-year-olds especially, who could sculpt at the level of what you might not even expect from a high school student here. The reason for that is not because they were such gifted individuals, which some people often thought in the beginning. It's because they had all this history of experience that by the time they could represent an idea, maybe growing into the 3-year-old's age, they had such facility with the materials that they could do so much more to represent those ideas. So the 100 languages is an integral part of this approach, and I think we've learned a lot, even though all good traditional early childhood education emphasizes supporting children's representation of their knowledge. This takes us to deeper and new levels than we understood in the past. In this country, I think we have certainly a strong tendency to focus on the individual, the development of the individual. And we know from looking at other countries and other cultures that there's, in some cases, more focus on the social context or the group. Well, in Reggio Emilia, both are given quite a bit of value. What we're often not looking at in the way that Reggio educators do is the dynamics of the group, the processes of learning that happen differently when children are interacting and in relationship than when they're just working alone. We can think of this from a theoretical point of view from Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development, where on one end of this zone, this is what the child can do by themselves and without help, but in this zone with more competent peers, one can go further and further and further. And the competent peer can be the other children in their classroom, in their small group, or it can be the teacher learning alongside them and helping them to think more deeply. So in this approach, we try to look at the group often as much as the individual. What I saw as unique the first time I visited in Reggio Emilia was a sense of calm, soothing, serene climate. And that manifested itself through an environment that was organic, that had a lot of living features, plants, a lot of use of natural light, home-like furniture, mixed in perhaps with purchased furniture for children that fits them. It was an environment that was settled and calming. Children were in a rich environment, yet not overstimulating environment. An environment where materials and furniture and equipment and documentation are beautifully organized in ways that draw children in, that entice them to want to stay with and think about how to use those materials in creative and focused ways. It really supports what I would call focused curiosity. And so it's that overall effect that I saw in Reggio Emilia, and now I've seen since we've studied that approach, it easily can happen in the U.S., and it is in many locations. The outdoor environments, when I think back to images of Reggio Emilia, were very soft and inviting and very natural, very involved in usage of the natural grasses and the trees and the life of animals that might be in the community. Could involve gardening, but it's mainly a place where children can explore as well as play, not necessarily full of equipment, but some. Certainly it should be a place where children can run free to some extent, to play with connections to nature, which we know even from research now helps them to come back into the classroom environment feeling more settled, more focused. So the outdoor environment has probably taken many directions, both in Reggio Emilia and in the U.S. But if it's treated as a very important learning place, then it's given as much attention as it is as the inside classroom is.
I've been an early childhood educator for a lot of years now, and always very involved in constructivist education that helped me to become very interested in the Reggio approach as a classroom teacher. So as a classroom teacher, I had the opportunity to visit Reggio Emilia and begin working in my classroom in Reggio-inspired ways that gave me a whole new lease on teaching and in being with children. At Maplewood Richmond Heights, I'm wearing several hats in the work that we've been doing here. I work as a consultant with the school and particularly with the preschool teachers. But as things evolved, and because it's part of my style that I work alongside, I don't sit back. I get involved, and so I have also assumed the role of the atelierista with the preschool children in particular. And that means that I work out of an atelier, a beautiful space, studio space, where we build experiences and wonderful moments that support thinking, creative thought, that may go into short-term or long-term projects, could be centered on painting or shadow play or architecture through blocks, could be something mathematically inclined, because an atelier really should support all of the 100 ways of learning that we can possibly think of. A child said to me recently, "This is a place that is bright and good," the atelier. So when the children come, most often I'm offering something particular that is connected to an ongoing study. Maybe an ongoing study or project that's happening in their classroom that I've connected with, or it may be something that I've provoked in the atelier. Recently, I offered some beautiful kinds of materials to create winter collages, because the children and I had been talking about how disappointed we were that we hadn't had snow. So we thought if we made some really beautiful collages, winter collages, it might make it snow. At the same time, I have some groups working on drawings of houses, because they have been studying the community that they live in and bringing photographs of their houses to school. And they're also playing this out, the houses. They're building their neighborhood out of blocks. And that's also possible in the atelier, and really becomes acts of architecture then. Or also what I've been seeing with the drawing of the houses, it's a kind of a self-portrait, really, that's emerging from each child. Then there are light tables. So children also have the opportunity to be building sculptures at the light table or drawing at the light table. It's really depends. That's why an atelier needs to be full of many materials and possibilities. In Reggio Emilia, the system involves pedagogista, a pedagogista as well as an atelierista in a school or in several schools. And the pedagogista is a person that comes into classrooms, is talking with the teachers about what they're observing and documenting, looking at the documentation with the teachers, so that together in a collaborative way, they're pushing each other's thinking or ideas or questions about what the children are showing them.
Well, the role of the teacher In some ways, you could describe it similar to what we understand from Piaget's theory about active learning. The teacher is a facilitator, a guide, a supporter, an observer, an assessor. But the emphasis that's, I think, somewhat unique in this approach, not totally unique, but the strength of it is that it's a role of learning with children and from children. It's not just directing and guiding and supporting, it's learning. It's about teaching as learning, about teaching as research. And so teachers' sense of wonder, sense of wanting to connect with children's ideas, giving value and respect to their thinking so that they want to probe and want to know what's behind what was said rather than just let it lay. Oftentimes, when we don't have that perspective on our role with children, we might guide and facilitate and direct, and children go through experiences, but we don't take the time to look deeper at what's the meaning behind what they drew, what's the meaning behind what they said, what's the feeling that's behind some actions or behaviors that they have. And in this approach, it's essential part of the role of the teacher to be in the moment with children, to treat them with such respect that they, as you would another adult that you're in conversation with, to listen. It's often referred to, Carlo Rinaldi talks about the pedagogy of listening. That's at the core of all of this. So the teacher is a listener. And listening, as she says, is more than just hearing. Listening is reading the child's expressions. Listening is looking at all that body language and the actions and thinking about children over time, how they communicate or behave or think in one context versus another.
The collecting of documentation, sometimes referred to as collecting the traces. So you want to be prepared as the teacher or the atelierista or anyone who's involved in observing or working alongside the children. So having a camera ready, if you're lucky, maybe you have more than one camera, so that there's maybe a couple of possibilities to capture moments through photography. More and more we're using video, and that's an exciting kind of development of for both us, for the educators as well as for the children, certainly for parents to see the results of that very active way of gathering documentation. The written form is so important as well, because often that is part reflection as well as capturing the details of the moment. And all of this is necessary to come together to the research about the child, the group of children, the surprise of learning that we can so easily miss if we don't document in some way.
The start of projects can happen in many ways. The most important feature of a project, though, is that children and teachers are engaged. Their minds are engaged. So it can begin by following a child's interests or a group of children's patterns of behavior that help you to know they're interested in something. It can, however, start with a teacher idea that might certainly be informed by the goals of the curriculum. But in any case, and I've written a few articles about this, about that it can be child-initiated and teacher-framed, but it can be teacher-initiated and child-framed. The main thing is that we come together in our excitement and interest and passion in terms of a project.
At present, in Maplewood Richmond Heights, and in a way, because we've been so inspired by connections to community in Reggio Emilia, we decided as a team of educators, particularly for the preschool, that we would study the question of what it means to be a child in Maplewood Richmond Heights. And we base this on a lot of reasons. This is a community that's in a kind of a renaissance, and many changes are happening. And we wanted to make sure that the children had a place in it all. And also because children aren't quite as visible as they once were. They're not out and about playing outside as much as we once saw them do. We felt it was a good opportunity to take walks and make connections with businesses and places within the community. So this project has been unfolding now during this entire school year, and it takes many directions dependent on the interest of the individual classes of children and teachers. I can give you for instance of a small group. Well, let me back up. A class walked to visit a photography studio, and I went along to document the experience. The children already, and these are 3 through 5-year-olds, and the children already had a question of how does a photograph happen? So they were ready to ask the photographer questions like these, and she was ready to respond. So we had that trip, but they were still curious. A small group was still very curious, and so I asked them to share their theories with me about how a photograph occurs. And with that small group, I spent maybe 5 days off and on of meeting with them, and they're drawing their theory of how the image goes into the camera, which they called the pretend person stays in the camera and the real person pops back out. And then the pretend person starts to travel through a wire to the computer. And the pretend person pops back out on the computer screen. And on until the pretend person swells up and pops out in a very large way on a screen from the projector from the computer. So the sky can be the limit, on the possibilities of a project dependent on the interaction and dialogue that's going on with the children and the adults.
One of the things I was most attracted to the Reggio approach about when I first visited, I had the extraordinary opportunity of spending an entire day with Carla Rinaldi, who is now the executive director of Reggio Children. At that time, when I visited in the early 80s, she was the head pedagogista over the entire system. And I was amazed when I asked her about parent participation. She said, well, what do you want to know about it? And this was about April of a year. I said, well, for example, do you have parent meetings? She said, oh, of course. We have lots of different kinds of parent meetings. There are many ways and always new kinds of parent conversations and communications and gatherings that can happen dependent on the needs of the moment. So she was describing the day before when she and the teachers had noticed a group of parents at the door as they dropped off their children talking about their concerns about sibling rivalry. So within a day, the teachers orchestrated an opportunity for them to come in and have a meeting to talk with educators, to think together about issues of sibling rivalry. So that's, very responsive. Giving them 101 or 1,001 different ways to participate depending on their ability and interest, but also making all of those ways visible through documentation, which in a visual way, photographs or video, but mainly photographs, maybe minutes of meetings that are posted so that parents look at what are the possibilities and are very subtly encouraged and enticed to want to be in that kind of setting, to participate in that kind of way.
It is one of the fundamentals of the Reggio approach that the family, parents, grandparents are very much part of the learning within the schools and the classrooms. And that is a different model than a lot of us may experience in our own schools for instance, in the United States. So thinking about how we build those relationships with families so that they're entering into meaningful dialogue with us that goes beyond kind of the average, what can I do to help out with a classroom party, or what can I do to maybe even support my child's learning at home. There's a lot more inviting in of family members to participate, to also look at documentation with the educators so that they're thinking together about how children are thinking. And then, you know, really asking parents or family members to reflect and possibly offer ideas of their own of how we could go further.
My background is in early childhood education, but my master's and my early experience as a teacher was all focused on children with special needs, early childhood special education. And when I went to Reggio for the first time, of course, I was looking for how children with special needs were supported. And I asked about this because I couldn't see, other than perhaps an obvious situation of a child in a wheelchair, I could see that children were just so fully included, and I wondered if they had separate classrooms or segregated programs. What I was told and what I grew to understand was that the approach to supporting children, and in Reggio it's referred to as children's rights, children with special rights, because it turns you around in thinking about young children rather than being needy, having powerful resources and rights, you know, to a good education. But what I understood was that whenever a child with a disability is identified in a school, an extra teacher is brought into the classroom so that there's an extra adult. That person gets consultation from a special ed educator, they're called pedagogista, in the Reggio approach. And that expertise is shared with all of the teachers so that the child can be fully included and participate in every activity in every way that other children in the classroom are. It's an approach that naturally lives up, it lives up in the best way I've ever seen to the philosophy of inclusion. The philosophy of inclusion is really about distributing children with identified special needs in a natural way across populations, not clustering them, not having reverse mainstreaming, not having most of your children with special needs in one classroom so that the resource people don't have to go to as many classes. It's about naturally distributing like you would in a normal population. So typically in the Reggio schools you would never see more than 8 to 10% of the children in the school who have identified disabilities. And sometimes at this very young age you can't identify yet those disabilities, but they're typically supported so well because of this active approach to education and the serene environments that oftentimes those disabilities don't even surface early on. So what I saw and what I understood was a really strong and pure philosophy of inclusion that was being implemented in these schools, and that children with special needs, from mild to some rather severe, were being fully supported without being pulled out, without being segregated, and with push-in services of support.
The first school that I went into in Reggio Emilia, I was really just brought to tears. Part of it was because I wanted it for children in this country. I wanted children to have beautiful surroundings that I was seeing and that I was being in Italy. I wanted them to experience the kind of learning that was so joyful and really out of the box in a lot of ways. But I also wanted it for myself. I wanted it for me as an educator. And I thought at that time, and I've often said since, that if I could come to work in a place like this, in the school in Reggio every day, I would be the happiest educator alive. And so that drove me in a lot of ways. But certainly what I think children have a right to, that they have a right to being thinkers, and they have a right to be creative. And sometimes in schools in our world these days, there's not much time for children to be thinkers and to be creative. So it is a passion.